All right, everyone. We have got super cool guest today. Super cool guest. I was really happy to get him on. It is Josh from the Crown of Command YouTube channel slash podcast. Man, love your content. Josh, your channels are one of my favorite channels to watch, and we'll get into a little bit why. But just Josh, just sort of introduce yourself, and maybe could you just give us a little bit of your history in this wargaming hobby?
Daniel, thanks very much for inviting me on. As I said before we went on live, that I don't get really asked a lot to come onto other podcasts, so it's always nice to for people to reach out and ask me on. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking to you about Old Hammer and about the Crown of Command with you and your wonderful listenership there. So I hope what I say today and what what we talk about is of some interest to some people, but yeah, I mean, if we want to go back to my roots and in history and wargaming initially, I mean that goes all the way back to I suppose, when I think about it, my fascination for things that were miniature were sort of like the plastic army men you bought in the
Hmm.
supermarket. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think maybe maybe as boys we all share that same kind of thing where I was attracted to G.I. Joe and anything that sort of um, war-like, miniatures, figurines that we could get from the supermarket for $2 a bag, and you got like a bunch of green US soldiers and grey Germans, and we had like a sand pit at the back of our property because we lived on a large property in New South Wales and Australia at that point. And my dad built me a big sandbox, and me and my next door neighbor, we used to spend hours in there. And I think it's all part of your imagination. It's all about visualizing and the tangible feeling of holding those little soldiers and miniatures in your hand, those little figurines that sort of got it really started. And then I sort of picked up some Tamiya catalogs of these incredible dioramas that these
Hmm.
people were painting and putting together. And that really, got my imagination going. And until I felt confident enough about buying those kits and assembling them and learning about how to paint them and all this kind of stuff. So, as many of us, we went through the journey of getting enamel paints like testers and Tamiya paints and all the smelly, horrible stuff that you used to deal with and
Uh-huh.
turpentine and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of my initial entry into modeling and not tabletop gaming as such, but just like, my love of miniatures and my love of, anything that's small and as a hobby. So it wasn't until, and I always liked board games. My mum got like me Stratego, which was a board game that she played with her sister in Italy. And she thought, oh, that might be a good game for you because we like playing Monopoly and
Yeah,
card
yeah.
games, all that kind of stuff. So that was really my first, I think, real like not miniature, but like a real strategy war game,
Hmm.
I think. And then I found on my grandmother's table, because she always read books and she collected books, and I think it was from my auntie that she had The Hobbit. And
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
of course, and of course, most of us have watched stuff on TV. We're fascinated with fantasy shows. I think Willow was around at that stage.
Hmm.
Because in like in my high school days. So she had this book called The Hobbit, and I sort of and I think she mentioned it was something to do with fantasy, and I thought, oh, okay, I might read that because, to be honest, I wasn't a big reader.
Hmm.
They couldn't force me to read books at school. I'm not the most academic-minded person. So The Hobbit was a wonderful entry into reading for me and getting immersed into J.R. Tolkien's world. And of course, it featured a lot of dwarves, and I like the idea of dwarves and I like the concept of them. And I think the next progression was Hero Quest when the ads on that came on Australian TV, and We saw a giant barbarian with his broadsword battling away with orcs and all kinds of nasties in the dungeons. And my mother bought me that with the Keller's Keep and
OG Hero
Return of the
Quest.
Witch Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep, and that was it, mate. That was basically I saw that, and that was like, wow, this is the
Mhm.
next level. This is, put away the Tamiya kits, put away all those, those models I was assembling. This is the next level. This is basically taking all those my love of playing games and modeling and putting it all together into one big thing. So, and seeing the painted samples on the side of the box just blew me away
Yeah.
because I mean, looking at the stuff that the guys are doing for Tamiya was incredible, but then seeing this was just a total different level
Uh-huh.
of wow, like how did they do this? Is this a digital image? Is this a real thing? And then I discovered it was real and sent away for the catalogs and the painting guide at Games Workshop, which cost a small fortune, cost about $10 back then for a returned envelope. My dad was not very happy, but what came back was essentially the Games Workshop catalog, which had Warhammer, third edition, Old Hammer. It was all Old Hammer back then. It was before the Hero Hammer, Middle Hammer era.
Huh.
So we're
Okay.
talking about third edition Fantasy, Road Trader 40K, first edition Space Marine, second edition Talisman,
Yeah.
second edition Blood Bowl, all
This
those
was
kind of classic games.
Yeah, that was probably so that was early late 80's, early 90's, right? When I think
Yep,
about Rogue
yep.
Trader. And that was really I know I would say I got in, it was 94. And so I came on, and it's funny you mentioned G.I. Joe and those Army men because before I even found out about these games, I was one of those guys. I was also Legos, but I wasn't just building, I was like mocking out battles and setting things up. And then I'll never forget, I used to trade cards, baseball cards, and the guy I went to, he basically expanded into war games. And so I'm walking in to get my baseball cards, and I saw Warhammer Quest, and which in its own right was a great game. Um, I was going to ask you too because would you characterize yourself as kind of an old hammer? We hear this term coming out, sort of old hammer. Would you sort of characterize your content and your channel in that sort of vein? Um,
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's a very, very fair question. Um, so when I entered the Games Workshop hobby officially, it was at that I was right at the cusp between third edition and what essentially was then fourth edition fantasy. If we're looking at that sort
mhm.
of kind of timeline of releases, so they were just about to make that switch. Brian Ansell, I didn't know who Brian Ansell was, but he, being the managing director of the company, was about to sell the company off to Tom Kirby, and it became this giant commercial thing, this monster that
That's
it
right.
later became. So I was sort of at that very late stage. I was about 17, got into HeroQuest, I got my third edition book. My grandmother bought me that. She was quite worried because it had a lot of demonology stuff in it.
Yeah.
It was pretty dark and twisted. And then I got the first edition Warhammer roleplay book from a guy at school, and so I really in my origins I really was an old Hammerer guy because that's where I first made contact with Games Workshop. These were the images, these were the miniatures that I first saw. Um, but then I very quickly switched into fourth edition because the box set came out. Because miniatures in Australia were not the easiest thing to get. The products
Yeah.
themselves were not so easy. So we need to make a pilgrimage up to Brisbane, which is the major capital city there, and go to this one place. I think it's called the Daily Planet,
Hmm.
which was what it was called. And they had a huge array of stock of miniatures and games from Games Workshop and comics and all that kind of stuff. And that's where we would get our things. But the idea of amassing enough models for a fantasy army, we just couldn't afford it. It was just
Mhm.
too much. It's too expensive. So when fourth edition came out, you got all your high elves. You got like I think 40 high elves and a 60 or so goblins or whatever. So it really gave you the the sort of the startup really, and the
Yeah.
terrain and the dice and everything, the rules obviously. So everything was supplied to you in one box, and that was kind of the beauty behind it. And the rules seemed more simple
Hmm.
because third edition, yeah, it's a beautiful looking book, but boy oh boy, for someone who's never played a war game, it is a very complex beast to get your
Yeah.
head around. And I just couldn't breach that. I had a couple of other guys at school who were Norwegian, much smarter than me, and they sort of kind of worked it out how to play it. So I got to see it played, but I never got to experience it. So fourth edition for me was kind of the breach from that, and that way I could get over the rules and find a way of working how that sort of worked, and then had the miniatures, so I could actually start playing around with those a lot more and painting them and really starting to learn how to paint properly. So my channel kind of is in that kind of breach,
Yeah.
in that gap. It's got a little smattering of old Hammer, but a lot of it's kind of that early 90s, 91, 92, 93, fourth and fifth edition era, second
Hmm.
edition 40K,
Second edition
because
40K. Yeah.
they're the games I'm most familiar with. And I'm now kind of discovering that kind of old Hammer, the games and everything now.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about early because I missed out on Rogue Trader, but I did what I actually did is I caught some people playing Man of War and people playing Epic. So all I knew is the games looked awesome. They had that paint scheme that was going. And I want to kind of bring this up because you hit on a few things. One, I want to talk about us revisiting the old days. There's something about going back to these old things. And you hit a couple of things that I feel the same way, which is that GW back in those days, it was a different company. I mean, I remember looking at those white dwarfs, and you see these guys who they didn't look corporate. They look, their long hair. It was the early 90's. The grunge movement was going on. And you're like, man, like there was something very personable there. There was something, and we'll get into some of your talks about some of the old white dwarfs, but I think that I remember me and you, and I think others, we like revisiting these old games because there's there was that magic in GW, right? Before it sort of turned into, did you mention a monster? I think you called it a corporate, and
Corporate monster. Yeah.
yeah, a corporate monster. So, but what do you think is like what is it about that people come back to this? Like I'm hooked on your channel. And what is it that it is about going back and revisiting these old games? Like were they better or were they worse or kind of is it just nostalgia here? Or what's sort of going on here?
That's a good question, Daniel. I think it's a mix of everything. I think it's in a way, I think a lot of it's the miniatures, and it didn't really. I didn't really get that until 4 or 5 years of doing this.
Hmm.
That it's not necessarily the games. Of course, it's the era. It's the photography. It's the nostalgia memories. It's yeah, of course, playing the games is a big part of it, but not a lot of people actually playing the games these days. They're sort of just nostalgically looking back and thinking, "Oh yeah, I used to play Man of War, or I used to play Warhammer Fantasy and fought with my friends endlessly after school." About the rules, and
Yeah.
that's what I hear most about is people fighting over with their friends about the rules and everything, and whether that harbors some kind of ill will towards the the old games, I don't know. But the miniatures, I think, is a big attraction for people because they're the first things they usually have in contact with. The white dwarves, the miniatures,
Yeah.
the imagery, the artwork, the people associated, like you say, there's a lot of people like Rick Priestley. They still remember these guys, Andy Chambers, Jervis Johnson, and
Those white
the
dwarfs making these
stories.
weird faces. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
They were in these white dwarfs making these weird faces. And, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. People go on. Yeah.
No, 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 that's fine, mate. But I think there's a soul to the games that even though they have these a lot of imperfections and typos and what have you, I think there's a soul to it that like you say, they were created by real gamers. It was, and I think. and I didn't really realize this until later. I think Brian Ansell, sorry, has a lot to be thanked for that because I think he gave a lot of freedom to those guys
Hmm.
where he just said, look, this is the concept or this is what I want you to make. Go ahead and make it. And they just did it. And I don't think there was and all they had to, and from Brian's point, it was like, I just want you to sell miniatures. That's what we are. We just want to sell miniatures. So just make a game that, incorporates the model range and you just go ahead and do whatever you want with it. And I think the guys being in their younger days, like Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley, and Nigel Stillman, they sort of conceived these wonderful ideas and grand sort of projects where they had like third edition. And I'm sort of just getting back into that now and discovering what an incredible project that would have been because you had all these books interlinked with each other. So you had all
Hmm.
the Chaos, Slaves of Darkness, Lost and the Damned, the role play book, the third edition fantasy book, Warhammer Armies, Warhammer Siege, and even Road Trader. They all kind of interconnected with each other,
Hmm.
and I think they were sort of games and passions out of the love of the hobby. I think, and I think that's sort of not to say that it eroded or slowly slipped away, but I think it became more and more sort of harnessed and guided by the marketing guys rather than the actual game developers. They wanted to create cool stuff, but I think it got sort of dictated more and more by the sales team to say, no, no, this doesn't sell, or you need to push
Hmm.
this. And I think Rick Priestley talks a lot about that in his interviews with other people. And I think they really wanted to push 40K and Space Marines. They were the big sellers, and they sort of slowly started, taking away a lot of the other quirkier side of games they were making, like Man of War and those kind of things. They just wouldn't sell commercially. They wouldn't be commercially viable for a company like Games Workshop, I think, in the later 90's or 2000s,
Yeah,
where it seemed
it's
at the initially it seemed like a really great idea, and they were thought, yeah, that's great. We want to make a naval combat game.
Yeah, it's sort of, and it's funny you mention the models. Now that you say that, I was watching some of your second editions, and you did orcs, and I think there's two. I remember when two armies in particular stick out to my mind at the time. One was orcs, the other was Tyranids. That this second to third edition switch, orcs. I remember when third edition orcs came out, and they felt so their personality, their quirkiness was just gone. And it was
Yeah,
this, I think they were still cool, but they weren't second edition orcs. And like people would, people have said, oh, orcs are cool and weird. I'm like, you don't know how weird and wacky they were if you didn't play second edition 40. Okay, I remember there was this huge gap, and I know what you're talking about. There was something lost in that wacky weirdness where orcs became I felt a lot more serious, a lot more scary, but they lost some of that weirdness to them. I love that. But the other thing to me that stuck out was Tyranids. Second edition Tyranids to me were such a great design aesthetic. They were just so cool. And I felt when they went to third edition, it's like all of a sudden they all became looking the same. They got these weird what is it called? I don't know. I just remember there was this stark difference. Did you notice that as well? Those numbers really stuck out to me as just being like these huge changes from second to third. Um, did you sort of see that similarly, or did you notice that in other armies that there was just something that there was some efficiency that went to third, but we lost a lot of that soul? Yeah.
yeah. I actually jumped ship when when I think it was the end of fifth edition fantasy. That was it for me.
Mm.
I already gave up on 40K. I was never a big 40K player anyway. I played Epic Space Marine for many years and loved that system and still do. I think it's one of the greatest games ever made, personally. Again, probably not commercially viable for Games Workshop. Hence the rebranding and changing and everything. But so yeah, I don't really have a lot to say about the later editions because at that point I was well and truly off and looking for the next thing.
Mm,
that I sort of gave up on Games Workshop at that point because what I'd loved before about Games Workshop, like you said, it was the quirkiness, the fun, having um, wonderful artwork, the color, the vibrancy, the highly saturated paint jobs, the photography,
mm.
all that was kind of changing to this very much darker look to the game worlds, and I just didn't really grab me so much.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you bring Epic because so I saw Epic being played as a kid, and then I think it was last year, this is getting my second year, I got into Epic. There's a local group, and they support a community-run version of Epic. They call it Net Armageddon. They play there's different versions, but you're right. When I played Epic, that is one of and it's very similar to they had their little tweaks, but I've looked at the different versions. It is an amazingly good game. Like it's just
mm,
an astoundingly. I think. I mean, you know, I haven't played it enough to. I would just say all the races they feel very like they should. It's
yep.
just the game feels so good that it's weird to me that we get G&W talking about how I feel like the quality of their games have sort of gone down while their market share seems to have gone up, you know? And like
Yeah.
where was this attention? Like to me, I just wonder how did we get such cool games back when it was just a whole bunch of just weirdos, you know, in the office. And I remember those old white dwarfs where these guys, like, they would make these weird faces and you loved them for it. Or you'd see these pictures of their offices and it's just like crap everywhere, you know? Like, yeah, like, you know, do
Yeah.
we, have we just lowered the standard on Games Workshop or what's happened there, you know? Or is it just the money selling machine now? What do you kind of think about that? What's your 2 cents on that?
Look, I think, you know, once, and I'm only talking on the perspective of what I know through interviews, listening,
Mm,
like recently, like this is the last few years, listen to Rick talk about it a lot, extensively actually, about that time and the shift. Um, and I can only speak on what I know. I don't know much about the modern Games Workshop.
mm,
I really don't know much about modern GW at all for the
mm.
last 20 plus years. Never played Lord of the Rings, never played Mordheim, never played any of the later editions of 40K, only dabbled in it slightly. So all I could see, and I think I picked up a White Dwarf every now and again, but I could see it was a totally different thing
Mm.
that I enjoyed when I first found the hobby. And I think it's very commercially driven, and obviously that was their main goal. I mean, they had stores to support and all that kind of thing. They obviously have a large payroll of people associated with the company. It's a big company in terms of what they do. So yeah, I suppose it was just an evolution of money coming into the company and investments being made. They need to make a return, all that kind of stuff. And it was
That's
time for that little Nottingham studio to grow into something else, and change, and the people change, and the strategies behind making games and all that kind of thing change as well, I suppose.
That's interesting that like I haven't heard from a lot of like that you've really have no and I think that's an interesting perspective that you have that you've just said uh, you've basically cut off and you said I have no information and to me it seems like you've saved yourself
I
endless
have.
amounts of time because I got through I had to quit 40K at 6th edition. Now
Right.
I like third, fourth, and fifth. I think that they were good, you know.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
I think there was a certain efficiency there, but so many years of just struggling and just being frustrated that you're just like, nope, I'm gonna go and live in my happy little land in the early night. And I think that's so cool. And that's cool, yeah. Now,
Yeah.
are there any mod outside of GW? Is there any other what I call modern games? Any other games that you enjoy outside of maybe, like you said, some of those older versions at GW? Have you got a chance to play any modern games? Anything that jumps out to you?
Yeah, I mean, once I left, around about 95, once I sort of tied my knot with Games Workshop and that was it, I looked at other alternative stuff and found Rackham, which is a French
Oh.
company.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know exactly when I found them. Of course, but in between that, I found alternative miniature companies like Black Tree designed, I think they were called Harlequin Miniatures then, and I collected some of their models and painted them. I think I sort of got out of gaming for a bit because we got into PlayStations and all that. I think PlayStation 1 was around at that point, and that consumed a lot of my time. And I sort of dabbled in painting, not much gaming. But later, yeah, found Rackham, and that
Mm-hmm.
sort of stirred a lot of my love and passion for painting again. So I did that for a long time. Didn't really dabble much in their games, but really enjoyed the painting of that. Then a friend of mine who I met through the confrontation Rackham stuff,
Mm-hmm.
he turned my eye to Infinity by Corvus Belli, the
Yep.
Spanish company, and their company ethos was to make their game as just as beautiful and the miniatures just as beautiful as what Rackham did for their company. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. They've got a lot of the old sculptors came across to them as well, and so we got into that, and I really enjoyed playing that and painting a lot of the miniatures and buying an airbrush and painting up the terrain and all that kind of stuff. And we try to recruit people in around our small city there to play Infinity, and we sort of played that every week or every fortnight. And I did that for about 10 years,
Hmm.
and that was the only game I played for about 10 years. It was just Infinity. That was
Oh,
it.
wow.
Um, and then yeah, then I just got sick of the rule changes. I think everyone goes through that. I think 40K players go through that. You get the next edition, the next thing, the
Mm-hmm.
next army, and I think I just got tired of it. So I sort of jumped out of that, then got back into the 90s gaming. But at the same time, I'm always, got my finger on the pulse everywhere. I look at websites, things flash up on Facebook. There's new products, there's new miniatures out there. I do like a board game, play a board game every now and again. Um, and then we started dabbling into, because I live in Japan, so naturally I want to play like something that's related to the country, like samurai or Sengoku sort of themed and that kind of thing. We found another Spanish company making games for what was called then Tori, which is like a skirmish game, and Kensei, which was a like a mass table game. And I helped the guy who was developing that rule set in the translation and stuff like that. So we sort of dabbled in that for a little bit, and then I found Test of Honor. Test of Honor came out,
Hmm.
and that's actually all done by ex-GW guys like Graham Davey and Andy Hobday. They're ex-GW guys. And really good system, great models. So I really enjoy that, and I've got a collection here, a small collection, be it that. But yeah, I really enjoy that. And now I'm getting into Baron's War. So as I'm now 50 years old, it's time for me to do some historical gaming. I'm getting grayer in the whiskers here. So I really like I like the game system. I like the miniatures that Paul Hicks makes for them. And so I started investing in buying some models and painting that up as well. So they're really the only two systems I play outside of the 90's games at the
Oh,
moment.
okay. Well,
Yeah.
I've been wanting to get into Infinity has always been on my radar, but I almost would have it. So we actually have a group that I'm going to be getting into Infinity.
Oh,
Um,
good.
but Test of Honor and Bear, I have to check these out as well. I know we have a local group that play Bushido, which is a skirmish game,
Right.
which is pretty solid. But I'll check those out. Um, it's yeah, I like about, but there's something about even those. There's a certain, I don't know what the term. I would say they're complicated, those old 90's GW games, but there is something about them that I haven't seen in another game. Maybe it's the little cards, or maybe it's all the little counters that you do. You don't see a lot of games do that anymore, like the warrior cards, or even the deck. Remember back in those days, you had the psychic phase was the deck of
Yep.
cards, and you always had the
That's
demonic
right.
attack, which you were just scared. I'll never forget how like I had nightmares about demonic attack. Well, that's cool. That's cool. Well, we would love to. I mean, I'd love to keep you on and talking for hours. One thing that jumps out to me that I love that you have on your channel, and guys, please go check out the Crown of Command if you haven't already, is your White Dwarf review. And
Mm.
I love when I think so. Your listeners they submit to you a White Dwarf, and you just go through it. And I think that's one of my like, when I'm painting miniatures, I put on those White Dwarf reviews. Um, Maybe just tell us a little bit. What's your favorite? Do you have a favorite White Dwarf that sort of that jumps out to you, or any? You can give us a few here that you just sort of felt where it really has that nice balance before it got all corporate. Because White Dwarfs did sort of turn very much into just a pure bland advertising tool. But yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look back into the really early White Dwarves, like in the 120s, 30s, 40s, they did a lot of advertising too, but not for their own products. It was mainly for other products to help finance and fund the magazine.
Hmm.
So they've got some really interesting stuff in there, like call-in role-playing games or what do you call those? What do you call those events where people dress up as characters and they go out and actually play out like
LARP,
a role-playing LARPing? Yeah.
LARPing,
So
yeah,
you got some really funny looking advertisements in there, and they advertise something like Raven Armory, like the guys who made all the helmets
yeah,
and swords for Golden Demon, and so yeah, I mean the older White Dwarves weren't. They weren't shy on advertising either. I think they did a lot of stuff for like D&D and other role-playing systems. So there was a lot of advertising in there. I think later they obviously stopped doing that altogether and just advertised solely on their own products, which makes sense. It's their own company.
hmm
But with the whole concept behind my first White Dwarf was that I think me and my friend Matthias, we talked about our first White Dwarf, and mine was 147, and his was 147. I thought, well, how about we just go grab a PDF and just talk about it? You know, you can just talk about where you got it from and where you first saw it and what your favorite articles were about it. And that's how it all started. And it's actually my favorite thing to do. It's my favorite video segment to do because I get to interview someone and they talk about their first White Dwarf and their memories of that issue and the articles in it and the miniatures and everything. And I think it's a really nice idea. I love doing them with people. We've got a whole host of those coming in the future as well. I've got at least two people lined up to do their first White Dwarves, and yeah, I've just found it a really nice way of sharing people's stories again in a different way.
yeah. It never forget. I'll never forget Stillmania. I don't know if you remember there was this article
Yeah,
by
yep,
Nigel Stillman called Stillmania. And you have to read it, but one of the ironic things is the stuff he says in that article would never get in modern GW, where he's like,
yeah,
keep the
yeah,
same
yeah,
army. He's like, don't chase the meta. And like, I remember reading that article about Stillmania, and it's like, this would never get in a White Dwarf. Like, this is the antithesis of what GW presents, you
yeah,
know?
exactly.
Yeah, I always thought that was sort of funny. And so I always think about White Dwarfs. I think of it in the, like you said, the Stillmania phase where people, yeah. Josh, man, I could talk with you all day. Can you just real quick, just give us so sci-fi and fantasy lore in wargaming specifically. If you could pick a favorite sci-fi and fantasy, it's something we ask all our guests. Let's ask them and say, do you have a favorite lore in a wargame for sci-fi and fantasy? And you can pick one. Yeah.
Favorite law?
Yeah.
Uh, well, I mean, I've to be honest, I've never been attracted to the lore of any game.
Hmm.
Isn't that strange? I've always been attracted to the artwork and the miniatures first and foremost. I think the lore sort of always became sort of a secondary thing or a third thing. But I mean, for fantasy, the first thing I encountered was Hero Quest and third edition fantasies and the role playing, and I really love those worlds. I think Bill King for me was the storyteller, the narrator behind all that, and I think his books and every all the literature he wrote for Warhammer
Mm-hmm.
for me was it just it. But I love second edition D&D too. I sort of played a
Mhm.
little bit of that on the World of Kryn and all that kind of stuff. I love that as well, and I love the books. Man, it's hard. Um, I think I'll go with D&D actually. I think I'll go D&D second edition. I think those
Yeah.
books, that series on Dragonlance, and I read Forgotten Realms, and yeah, I think I'm going to have to go with D&D. As much as I love Warhammer, I think D&D. Um, that I really hope and pray that they make a TV series on that.
Mm.
If they do this, if they give the same production values as Game of Thrones, but for the Dragonlance world
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
series of books, man, that would be so good. I can only dream of that happening in my lifetime that they do that because there's some wonderful stories and characters in those books.
Second edition Forgotten Realms, you're right. That I don't know if it's nostalgia talking, but there was something about the writing itself which was so inviting. Very good. Another thing I'd love to ask is, we're war gamers, but this is our hobby and we have to sort of fit it into our lives. But let's suppose you were a Bill Gates millionaire and you had all the time in all the world. I always like to ask, what's your dream wargaming experience? If time and money were not a problem and like you could do whatever you wanted, what would it be?
I think it's been talked about a lot that going to make the pilgrimage to the Bring Out Your Lead in the UK
Hmm.
at Newark would be the dream for me. And sadly, Brian Ansell passed away a couple of years ago.
Hmm.
So I'll never get to meet the great man and shake his hand and thank him so much for all the wonderful years of a hobby that I got to enjoy because of him. But I'll get to enjoy playing a huge game of Warhammer Fantasy with my friends that I've met through the Crown of Command that all live in Europe and the UK. And that's something we've got planned. We're planning the Gathering of Might. It's a famous White Dwarf campaign they ran at the studio involving like tens of thousands of points of orc and goblins and
Oh
chaos
wow.
dwarves versus the Empire and Wood Elves. So that's kind of our dream objective at the moment to do that. And if I can make my way to the UK with and meet up with some friends there and play that, and hopefully Nigel Stillman will be coming along, and
Oh
maybe Jervis
wow.
Johnson or Rick Priestley will head down or something like that, or Kev Adams, my favorite sculptor. That will be the greatest, thing I could do, I think, in my lifetime,
Wouldn't that be
to do that.
cool? Wouldn't that
Yeah,
be
mate,
cool?
it'd be awesome. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit of what you have planned? So 2025. What can some of my viewers expect for the Crown of Command, a YouTube channel and podcast? What sort of you have on your agenda?
Yeah, I mean, 2025 um, is going to see a lot more video content. Um, so, yeah, the stuff I'm sort of doing now is kind of just sort of quick and easy, getting some miniatures, talking about some models, getting a book, talking about the book. My First White Dwarf obviously be a prominent segment for the channel as well. Keeping it real, getting battle reports out there when I can. Of course, that takes a long time. Mate, you're a video editor as well for your channel, so it takes a lot of time to do those kind of things. But yeah, bringing some regular content, talking a lot about Oldhammer. I'm sort of just getting back into Oldhammer now. I just finished off doing a first edition Warhammer roleplay session with some guys in the States through
Oh, that's
Discord,
cool. That is cool.
and I've got an Oldhammer elf army here I'm painting up. I'm going to start doing that today, and we're going to play third edition this year. So, and I'm editing a Adeptus Titanicus battle report now for the channel. So I think 2025 will be the year of Oldhammer, mate. Going back to my roots, going back to where it all started, and playing a lot of those games. I think this year.
Very cool. Josh, thank you so much for your time. And we're looking, like I said, we'll be watching.
Wonderful, thanks so much again, Daniel, for asking me on. I really appreciate that, mate. It was nice to meet you.